having the football on in the house meant there was deadly silence. You weren't allowed to move, you weren't allowed to go into that room. And if you did, there would be consequences to that action.
For many of us, the World Cup will dominate the next few weeks as we feast on the football, but evidence from previous tournaments does show that domestic violence goes up during big football events. Let's speak to Claire Kelly, Associate Head of Policy at the NSPCC. Good morning to you, Claire.
Good morning to you.
And to Jess Finnegan, whose biological father subjected the family to years of domestic abuse. Good morning to you, Jess.
Good morning.
Claire, let me start with you. I think this is something that people now know, but now that there's more awareness of it, has that had an impact on the figures, on how much domestic violence there is, or not?
It certainly has. So you're right. We are pleased that more people are aware and are being more vigilant and looking out for each other, which is really great. But unfortunately, the statistics for the last World Cup showed that young people reached out 33% more than they would in a normal time. That's a staggering figure. So we need to be prepared and even more aware this year as the World Cup begins. We're not saying it isn't a time to enjoy. Of course we do. Sport can be incredibly good. But for people living with domestic violence, this time brings nervousness and fear.
And Jess, for you, it was the '98 World Cup. Can you explain to us how that had an impact on what was happening in your family home?
Yeah, of course. So at the time, I was about 8 years old, in primary school, and I remember I've got a very, very vivid memory of myself and one of my close friends, and we were chatting away, and he would explain how him and his dad would watch football together all the time, and he loved it. We shared the same birthday, and the final was actually on our birthday as well. And I just remember sitting there thinking, that's never an experience I've ever had, and I don't think it'll be an experience I would ever be able to share with Gary in the future either. It wasn't our family setup. To us, having the football on in the house meant there was deadly silence. You weren't allowed to move, you weren't allowed to go into that room. And if you did, there would be consequences to that action as well.
So that was just so that wasn't was that necessarily to do with the team that he was supporting and whether that team did well, or was that just because football was on and that took precedence over everything, over family life?
So with my situation, we suffered domestic abuse for a number of years, and it wasn't just football. It was prevalent throughout our childhood. But when football came on, although he wasn't necessarily a massive football fan, he still followed the World Cup and other sporting events. And for him, it was a way of controlling us. It was just another excuse for him to be able to abuse us, really. It was never his fault, it was always ours. And if we'd interrupted the football, then again, that would be our fault. But there was also times where if we lost, he would have betted against, a certain team, and there'd be money lost there. Or if he'd been drinking as well, that would always aggravate the situation, and we would always bear the brunt of that.
Goodness me. And Claire, are these the kind of stories that you've heard?
Incredibly, sadly, yes, Jess isn't alone in this. That is what we're hearing around alcohol abuse will increase during that time. Betting, we're even more worried about that this year with the cost of living crisis going on and how people might be responding to that even more. But it is definitely this element of control, as Jess says. This is the reason that people use football or other big sporting events as reasons.
Mm-hmm. Now, the situation for Jess, obviously, in '98 as a I think she said 8-year-old school, an 8-year-old child. Presumably, well, is it different to an 8-year-old child today? What kind of help would there be available for an 8-year-old child in that situation today, and her mother?
So there is help available, of course there is, but what we're worried about at the NSPCC is that this is not consistent right across the United Kingdom, and we're striving to make it so, which is why we're calling on the Deputy Prime Minister to please strengthen the Victims Bill that's coming through. Children were recognised as victims within their own right in the field of domestic abuse last year, but we need the services that match that to be there for them whenever they are required. Support for young people is different to that of adults, and that needs to be recognised. This is why we're making that call to government for more help and more assistance for people like Jess when they were that young, and we need to advocate for them even more.
Um, Jess, finally, then, what do you think would help? I mean, clearly the situation has changed since since '98. But what is there one thing that you think would have, I don't know, would have helped you, or perhaps would help someone in your situation today?
It was somebody else speaking out, because at the end of the day, I was a child. I'd had my voice taken away from me, and I needed an adult. I needed somebody within, say, the school, with a neighbour, somebody within the community who knew and who had seen the abuse happening. I needed them to step forward for me, for my brother, and for my mum. And if somebody had done that for us, then potentially we would have got out of that situation a lot sooner. And again, as Claire said, to have that support in place at the time. My mum was supported as a victim, as an adult victim, but as children, although me and my brother had seen everything, we were then moved to a refuge. Still from that point, we weren't seen as victims, we were seen as bystanders, and we weren't given that support. So that has affected myself and my brother later on into adulthood as well.
Well, Jess, listen, thank you so much for talking to us. I'm sure there'll be people listening who will recognise some of your story. I'm sure, and hopefully it gives them some strength. Thank you so much for talking to us. That's Jess Finnegan, whose biological father subjected the family to years of domestic abuse, as you've heard. And we also heard from Claire Kelly, Associate Head of Policy at the NSPCC.